Imagine walking toward a building that represents your future, your dreams, and your right to an equal chance, only to be met by a screaming, hateful mob. Imagine seeing soldiers, not there to protect you, but to keep you out. This isn't a scene from a movie. This was the real-life gauntlet run by 9 brave teenagers in 1957. Their names are etched into the stone of American history, the Little Rock Nine. They were just kids, wanting to go to school, but their simple desire became a battleground for the soul of a nation. They didn't carry weapons, they carried books. And for that, they faced a firestorm of hatred that could have killed them. What would you do? Where would you find the courage to take that first step? Get ready to hear the incredible, heart-wrenching, and ultimately triumphant story of the students who risked everything just to walk through a front door. It's 1954, and the air across America feels thick with a cautious hope, a feeling that something big is about to change. For decades, the South, and a good chunk of the rest of the country, had lived under the rule of separate but equal. Everyone knew it was a lie. Separate was definitely the rule, but equal? Not a chance. Black schools got the hand-me-down books, the rundown buildings, and the teachers who had to do more with less. White schools got the brand new everything. This was just a fact of life, as solid as the concrete sidewalks you walked on. Then came May 17, 1954. On that day, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a decision that shook the foundation of that separate world. The case was Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, and the ruling was simple but explosive. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The segregation of public schools was now unconstitutional. In plain English, the highest court in the land said, "Stop separating kids by race." For the Black community, this was a massive spiritual victory. It was a promise, a beacon of light showing a way out of the darkness of Jim Crow. People wept in the streets, hugged, and dared to dream about a future where their children could get the same quality of education as anyone else. Little Rock, Arkansas, a city that saw itself as a little more progressive than the Deep South, was watching closely. The city was a blend of Southern tradition and a modernizing spirit. Its school board, in a move that felt almost revolutionary, announced a plan to integrate its schools, starting with Central High School. They didn't jump right into it. They wanted a gradual change, starting in 1957. This decision put a huge target on Little Rock's back. For those who believed in white supremacy, Brown versus Board was a declaration of war on their way of life. They saw integration as a threat to their entire social order. And Central High, that huge, beautiful, imposing high school, was going to be the first battleground. The plan was slow, maybe too slow for some, but it was a plan nonetheless. They would start with a small group of the most qualified, the best behaved, and the most prepared Black students. This was an attempt to keep things calm, to ease the transition, but anyone paying attention knew that calm was probably the last thing they were going to get. The Little Rock School District began to interview and vet potential students. They were looking for students who had excellent grades, strong attendance records, and, most importantly, the mental and emotional fortitude to handle what everyone knew would be a stressful, possibly dangerous situation. They interviewed dozens of young people. These were bright, ambitious teenagers who knew that crossing that threshold wasn't just about getting a better education for themselves. It was about tearing down a wall for everyone who came after them. They knew the risk, but they also knew the reward. This wasn't just a chance to get into a new school. It was a chance to finally claim their rights as American citizens. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would define a generation. Out of the many who applied, 9 were finally chosen. They would become the Little Rock Nine. They were about to take on the weight of history. Who were these 9 teenagers? They weren't political firebrands or seasoned activists. They were kids with homework, crushes, and after-school jobs. They were regular high school students from tight-knit, God-fearing families who understood the value of an education. But they had a certain steel in their spine, a quiet strength that set them apart. They knew the assignment was bigger than them. There was Ernest Green, the only senior in the group. He was serious, focused, and determined to graduate from Central High. He knew that if he could just get that diploma, it would be a symbol that could inspire countless others. He was the eldest, the one everyone looked up to for a calm presence. Elizabeth Eckford was shy and quiet, with a quiet strength you could feel. She would soon face the mob alone, a moment that would be captured in one of the most famous and heartbreaking photographs of the civil rights movement. Jefferson Thomas was known for his calm, easygoing demeanor and his good sense of humor, which he would need to get through the long, grueling months ahead. Terrence Roberts and Carlotta Walls Lanier were both serious, good students who believed deeply in the importance of their mission. Carlotta was the youngest girl in the group, showing a maturity far beyond her years. Melba Patillo Beals was quick-witted and determined. She was already learning to stand up for herself and would document her experiences in a powerful memoir. She had a spirit that refused to be broken. Minnie Jean Brown had a wonderful voice and a lively spirit. She was also the one who, perhaps, had the hardest time holding her tongue against the daily, relentless torrent of abuse. Gloria Ray Carlmark was a dedicated student who was focused on the academic opportunities Central High could offer. She was precise and driven. And finally, Thelma Mothershed suffered from a heart condition, but her desire for a better education was so strong it overcame her physical challenges. These 9 students and their families met regularly through the summer of 1957. They were prepped by Daisy Bates, the remarkable and fearless head of the Arkansas chapter of the NAACP. Bates was their general, their counselor, and their fierce protector. The meetings weren't about math or history, they were about survival. They were taught nonviolent resistance. They learned to keep their heads down, not to fight back, not to react to insults, and, most importantly, to walk tall. Their instructions were simple. No matter what anyone said or did, they were to remember why they were there. Their goal was to get through the school day. The local school officials tried to negotiate with the segregationists, but the resistance was already hardening. Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas, who was facing a tough re-election, saw an opportunity. He started dropping hints that violence might erupt if the black students tried to enroll. He began to suggest that he was the one trying to prevent bloodshed by keeping the schools separate, twisting the narrative completely. The atmosphere in Little Rock was turning sour, heavy with fear and anticipation. The world was watching, and the 9 students, now feeling the weight of that attention, kept preparing. They knew a simple act of walking to school had become a monumental act of courage. They packed their notebooks and sharpened their pencils, ready to face the first day. The first day of school was set for September 3, 1957. The plan was clear. The Little Rock 9 would enter Central High School and begin their classes. Everything was tense, but there was a hope that the power of the law, the Supreme Court's ruling, would be enough to open the doors. Daisy Bates and the NAACP had communicated the schedule to the students. They were supposed to gather together and walk in as a group, offering mutual support and protection. But Governor Faubus had a different, darker plan. He chose to ignore the law of the land and listen instead to the loudest, most hateful voices in the state. On the evening of September 2nd, just hours before the students were due to arrive, Faubus went on television. He gave a dramatic, fear-mongering speech, claiming that violence was imminent and that he had a duty to protect the public. To do this, he announced, he was deploying the Arkansas National Guard to Central High School. The message wasn't subtle. Faubus wasn't sending the Guard to protect the 9 black students from the mob. He was sending them to keep the black students out of the school. He was using the state's military force to defy a federal order. This was a clear act of rebellion against the United States government and a punch in the gut to the civil rights cause. When the sun rose on September 3rd, the scene at Central High was chilling. Soldiers in uniform, armed, stood shoulder to shoulder, completely encircling the school. This was not a welcome sight. It was a blockade. Daisy Bates quickly got word to the students to stay home that day. They had to regroup and figure out a new strategy. The atmosphere was too volatile. However, a crucial communication mix-up occurred. Elizabeth Eckford, the quiet student we talked about earlier, didn't have a phone, and her family didn't receive the call telling them to stay home. She didn't know the plan had changed. All she knew was that she was supposed to go to school. So, on the morning of September 4th, Elizabeth Eckford arrived at the corner of 14th and Park Streets in Little Rock, completely alone. She was dressed neatly, carrying her school books, and she walked with a determined, if nervous, step toward the school's front entrance. What met her was a sight no teenager should ever have to see. The streets were packed with a screaming, angry mob of white citizens. And standing in front of the massive, beautiful high school were the soldiers of the Arkansas National Guard, bayonets fixed. Elizabeth walked right up to a young soldier, trying to be calm, and asked for permission to enter the school. The soldier, on Phoebus's direct order, raised his rifle and blocked her path. He told her she couldn't pass. Elizabeth, confused and now truly alone, tried to find another way in, moving down the line of armed men. Each one turned her away. As she walked, the mob began to swell and press in. They screamed the most vile, hateful things imaginable: threats, insults, and racist slurs. Photos from that day show her face, a perfect mix of dignity, terror, and profound sadness. She wasn't an activist, just a girl trying to get an education, and she was being hunted. Eventually, she found a bus bench where she sat, surrounded by hate, until a kind white woman and a reporter helped her safely escape on a city bus. The image of Elizabeth Eckford, alone against an army and a mob, became the defining image of the crisis. Governor Phoebus had won the first battle, using the National Guard to enforce segregation and betraying the fundamental rights of 9 American children. The fight had only just begun. The sight of Elizabeth Eckford alone and facing down armed soldiers was not just a local scandal. It was an international disgrace. The Soviet Union jumped on the story, using it as propaganda against the United States. Look, they essentially said, at the great American democracy, where a child has to face a military blockade just to get an education. This was a major embarrassment for President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was trying to project an image of American strength and moral leadership on the world stage. Phoebus's move wasn't just illegal. It was making the entire country look weak and hypocritical. The legal fight immediately escalated. The NAACP lawyers, led by Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first Black Supreme Court justice, rushed to federal court. They argued that Governor Phoebus was not only violating the Supreme Court's mandate, but was actively creating the very disorder he claimed to be preventing. His actions were a blatant defiance of federal authority. The court process was quick and intense. On September 20th, a federal district judge named Ronald Davies issued an injunction. An injunction is a fancy word for a court order, and this one was crystal clear. Governor Phoebus had to remove the Arkansas National Guard immediately. The judge declared that Phoebus had used the soldiers simply to obstruct the court-ordered integration, and that was unacceptable. Phoebus had a choice: obey the federal court or directly defy the federal government. He chose the latter, but he couldn't keep the National Guard there legally. So he pulled the soldiers out. As soon as the guard was gone, the scene outside Central High turned even uglier. Phoebus had removed the military presence, which, ironically, had been the only thing keeping the most violent elements of the mob from completely surrounding the school. Now, the mob, hundreds strong, angry, and feeling victorious, took over the streets completely. The next time the 9 students tried to enter was on September 23rd. This time, they arrived in cars, slipping into a side entrance. For a fleeting moment, they were inside Central High School. But their presence quickly became known to the crowd outside, which had swelled to over 1,000 people. The scene outside turned into a riot. People were yelling, throwing rocks and bricks, and fighting with the few local police officers who were trying desperately to hold the line. The police, completely overwhelmed by the sheer size and fury of the mob, realized they couldn't guarantee the students' safety. The images broadcast that day showed absolute chaos. Police struggling, the crowd surging, and the sheer force of hatred being directed at the school building itself. School officials made the heartbreaking decision to remove the 9 students just a few hours after they had entered. For their safety, they were taken out a back door and driven away. The mob celebrated their removal as a victory, proving to them that violence could successfully overturn the law. The gravity of the situation was now undeniable. A state government had defied the U.S. government, and the mob had proven they could prevent integration through sheer terror. President Eisenhower knew he had to act, and he had to act decisively. The stakes were too high to allow anarchy to rule. The sight of armed soldiers blocking American children from going to school, followed by a violent mob successfully forcing those children out, was a breaking point for President Eisenhower. He was a war hero, a man who believed deeply in order and the Constitution. He couldn't stand by and allow a state governor and a furious mob to nullify federal law. This wasn't just about a school. It was about the rule of law and the ultimate authority of the federal government. The alternative was chaos, and Eisenhower wasn't going to let that happen. On September 24, 1957, President Eisenhower made one of the most significant and dramatic civil rights decisions of the era. He issued Executive Order 10730. This order did two things. First, it federalized the entire Arkansas National Guard, effectively taking command away from Governor Faubus. Now, if the Guard was sent to Central High, they would be acting on behalf of the president, not the governor, and their job would be to enforce integration. Second, and far more powerfully, Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne Division, an elite, combat-ready unit of the United States Army known as the Screaming Eagles, to Little Rock. These were not local police or guardsmen. These were paratroopers fresh from training, tough and highly disciplined soldiers. For the first time since the Reconstruction era, a U.S. president had deployed federal troops to the South to protect the rights of black citizens and enforce a federal court order. The sight of those federal troops arriving in Little Rock was stunning. Hundreds of paratroopers, wearing helmets and carrying rifles, established a perimeter around Central High School. They set up jeeps, checked their weapons, and took positions that made it perfectly clear. This was now federal territory, and resistance would not be tolerated. This was military force, ordered by the commander-in-chief, to ensure the Constitution was upheld. The next day, September 25th, the Little Rock Nine were ready. They were loaded into a military station wagon and, surrounded by a convoy of armed jeeps and soldiers, were driven directly to the front entrance of Central High. When they stepped out, they weren't met by a screaming mob. They were met by the grim, silent, and reassuring presence of the 101st Airborne. A young soldier was assigned to each student, not just to walk with them, but to serve as a personal, 24/7 bodyguard. As the 9 students walked up the steps, framed by the towering facade of the school and flanked by armed troops, they walked straight past the silent, defeated remnants of the mob. The crowds were still there, shouting their hate from across the street, but they were powerless. They couldn't break the military cordon. It was a surreal, historic moment. The raw power of the federal government had stepped in to protect 9 brave children and the promise of equal rights. The door to Central High was finally open. Walking through the front door of Central High with a paratrooper escort was a victory, but it was just the beginning of the war. Once inside, the 9 students found themselves in a unique and utterly hostile environment. The federal troops were stationed outside the classrooms and in the hallways, ensuring the students could enter the school and move between classes without being physically attacked. However, the soldiers couldn't follow them everywhere, and the students were surrounded by over 2,000 white students, many of whom were determined to make their lives a living hell. The abuse was instant, relentless, and sophisticated. It was psychological warfare. The segregationist students weren't stupid. They knew the troops were watching the big, obvious fights. So they developed hundreds of tiny, cruel ways to harass the 9. In the hallways, they'd trip them, often pretending it was an accident. In the cafeteria, food was deliberately spilled on them or their chairs would be pulled out from under them. In the classrooms, they'd be whispered slurs, have trash thrown at them, or find their lockers smeared with excrement. The students sat in silence, surrounded by faces that ranged from outright hatred to cold, indifferent hostility. Teachers were often unwilling or simply too afraid to intervene. Melba Patillo-Beals faced constant physical threats. She described being thrown down the stairs, having acid thrown toward her eyes, and enduring a constant barrage of insults. Minnie Jean Brown, the more outgoing student, was often targeted for her refusal to simply fade into the background. She endured endless taunts, often involving food. One day, fed up after days of being harassed in the cafeteria line, she accidentally dropped a bowl of chili on the head of a boy who had been tripping her. This incident, which quickly became known as Chilligate, was treated as a major offense by the school administration, even though Minnie Jean was reacting to persistent abuse. The white student faced no consequences, but Minnie Jean received a suspension. The administration's response often seemed to put the responsibility for keeping the peace entirely on the Little Rock Nine, demanding they be perfect victims who never reacted to provocation. The 9 students, committed to their mission, tried their best to follow the training Daisy Bates had given them: nonviolence. They walked with their eyes forward, they kept silent, and they clung to their goal. But the emotional toll was immense. They were isolated, their phone lines were constantly threatened, their families were worried sick, and every single school day was an act of survival. The paratroopers, while essential for keeping them alive, couldn't stop the constant, corrosive psychological attack. The halls of Central High were an emotional and academic pressure cooker. The students had won the right to sit at a desk, but they still had to fight every minute just to stay in the chair. The presence of the 101st Airborne was a relief, a huge weight off the shoulders of the Little Rock Nine, but the day-to-day pressure was unbearable. You have to remember, these were just kids. They were teenagers dealing with the normal stress of high school, pop quizzes, college applications, dating, and friendship, but they were doing it under the stress of a national crisis. Their classrooms were not just places of learning, they were emotional battle zones. The constant hostility began to wear them down, chipping away at their resolve. The students couldn't talk back, they couldn't fight back, and they couldn't even complain too much, because they knew the moment they slipped up, the segregationists would pounce, looking for any excuse to get them expelled. They were under a spotlight that magnified every move they made. Their friendships suffered, too. The nine had to stick together for safety, creating a tight-knit but often isolated group. They couldn't make new friends in the school, or at least, not easily. A few white students did try to be kind, offering a quiet nod or a helping hand, but those students were immediately targeted and harassed by the segregationist crowd. The cost of friendliness was simply too high. So, the Little Rock Nine were, for the most part, completely alone inside those massive walls. Imagine being in class, trying to focus on geometry or English literature, while knowing that the person next to you hates your guts and might try to hurt you during the passing period. The tension was exhausting. Melba Patillo-Beal spoke often about the profound fear she carried everywhere. She had to constantly look over her shoulder. Every bathroom break, every trip to the locker, was a moment of potential danger. Thelma Mothershed Ware's existing heart condition was exacerbated by the severe stress. This wasn't just mental anguish, it was physically draining them. Their families felt it, too. Parents worried sick every morning until their child returned home safely. They endured hate mail, threatening phone calls, and economic pressure. Some parents lost their jobs simply because their children dared to go to Central High. The parents were just as heroic as their kids, supporting them through unimaginable difficulty. They had to be pillars of strength while their own lives were falling apart around them. Their mission was clear: education at any cost. But the price they were paying was astronomical. The physical barricade might have been broken by the troops, but the emotional barricade of hate was still standing strong inside the school. As the weeks turned into months, the climate at Central High did not improve significantly, even with the troops there. The harassment simply became more subtle. Students learned to throw objects from hidden angles, to trip them in blind spots, and to use psychological tactics that the soldiers couldn't necessarily stop. The administration, unfortunately, often sided with the tormentors, preferring to punish the victims for disruption rather than address the root cause of the hatred. This atmosphere of constant attack led to the tragic expulsion of one of the Little Rock Nine, Minnie Jean Brown. Minnie Jean, who was a lively and outspoken teenager, found it nearly impossible to maintain the stoic silence demanded by the strategy of nonviolence. After the famous Chili Gate incident, where she dropped chili on a tormentor after persistent harassment, she was suspended. While the suspension was a warning, the abuse she faced only intensified upon her return. Then, one day, she was provoked again. She was eating lunch and was reportedly harassed by two girls who threw a purse and a can of soup at her. Minnie Jean, completely fed up and unable to endure the cruelty any longer, finally snapped. She called the girls a derogatory name. It was an understandable, human reaction to weeks of torture, but it was exactly the reaction the segregationists were hoping for. The school administration immediately seized on this. They permanently expelled Minnie Jean Brown for retaliation. Her expulsion was a profound blow to the remaining 8 students. It proved that the system was rigged. If they were attacked, they had to suffer in silence. But if they defended themselves, even verbally, they would be punished. It was a clear victory for the segregationists, who had successfully eliminated one of the integrated students. Minnie Jean was forced to leave Little Rock and eventually completed her high school education in New York City. The remaining 8 understood the lesson. They had to be robots. They had to be perfect, unemotional, and completely non-reactive, no matter the provocation. The price of their survival was the suppression of their own natural human emotions and responses. It took an incredible amount of willpower and maturity for those remaining students to continue walking those halls, knowing that any slip-up would result in their own removal. They were 8 students now, 8 targets, and the pressure was heavier than ever. But they kept their heads down and kept walking toward graduation. The entire, arduous school year, from September 1957 to May 1958, was leading up to one singular, symbolic moment for the Little Rock Nine, Ernest Green's graduation. Ernest was the only senior among the 9. His diploma was not just a piece of paper. It was a testament to his endurance, the triumph of the law, and a crucial victory in the civil rights movement. As the school year wound down, the intensity around the school remained high. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne had been withdrawn in November 1957 and replaced by the newly federalized Arkansas National Guard, who were still doing their duty to protect the students. But the underlying tension never went away. Through it all, Ernest Green, with his quiet determination, had kept his focus. He had attended classes, studied, and avoided every trap set for him. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for May 27, 1958. It was a massive event, held in a large auditorium, and the security presence was massive. President Eisenhower made it clear that this moment would not be ruined by violence. The threat of a segregationist disruption was very real, so the security was tightened, with guards posted everywhere. When Ernest Green's name was called, the entire auditorium held its breath. The silence was deafening. He walked across the stage, accepted his diploma, and shook hands with the principal. As he walked, a small, quiet moment occurred. The majority of the white attendees sat on their hands, refusing to applaud the black graduate. But a few members of the audience, including a small group of white students who had quietly supported the 9, clapped. It was a small sound, but in that charged atmosphere, it sounded like thunder. Ernest Green later recalled how he felt. It was probably the first time that I was so happy and so sad at the same time. He had achieved his goal, but he knew the immense sacrifice it took. He was the first black graduate of Central High School. His success proved that integration could work, that black students could compete academically, and that courage could, eventually, overcome hatred. But the victory was short-lived. Governor Faubus, furious and unwilling to admit defeat, was already plotting his next move to stop integration. The graduation of Ernest Green was a high point, but Faubus was about to escalate the conflict to an unprecedented level, throwing the entire Little Rock school system into chaos to prevent the remaining 8 from returning. The fight for the next school year was about to become even more difficult. The graduation of Ernest Green was supposed to signal the turning point, the moment Little Rock accepted the rule of law. But Governor Orville Faubus saw it as a temporary setback. If he couldn't stop integration by blocking the doors, he would try to destroy the entire school system. Faubus was facing another election, and his defiance of the federal government had made him a hero to segregationists across the South. In the summer of 1958, he pushed a radical and destructive plan. He got the state legislature to pass a law allowing the governor to shut down any public high school in the district if integration was forced upon it. Faubus immediately put this law into effect. In September 1958, when the remaining 8 members of the Little Rock Nine, now sophomores and juniors, were preparing to return, they found Central High locked. And not just Central High. Faubus closed all 4 public high schools in Little Rock. This act was devastating. It meant that over 3,700 high school students, black and white, were suddenly left without a school to attend. Faubus essentially held the entire future of the city's youth hostage to maintain segregation. He declared that it was better to have no public schools at all than to have integrated ones. This period became tragically known as the Lost Year. The white community in Little Rock was deeply divided. Wealthier white families quickly organized private segregation academies, schools established purely to avoid integration. Others began driving their children to schools in neighboring districts. But many working-class white families, who couldn't afford tuition or transportation, saw their children's education simply halt. The economic and social cost of Faubus's obsession was enormous. The Little Rock Nine and the other black students were the hardest hit. They were already marginalized, and now they had nowhere to go. Their families, with the help of the NAACP, had to scatter the students across the country. Carlotta Walls Lanier and Jefferson Thomas stayed in Little Rock, attempting to find correspondence courses. Melba Patillo Beals moved to California. Elizabeth Eckford and others found homes with sponsors in places like St. Louis and New York just to finish their education. The bonds of the nine were stretched across the map, all because a politician preferred ignorance to equality. The fight wasn't just physical anymore. It was a battle for the very existence of public education. The lost year wasn't just a political battle. It became a massive community crisis. Little Rock was torn in two. On one side stood Faubus and the extreme segregationists, who celebrated the school closings as a victory for states' rights, even if it meant destroying their own community. They didn't care about education. They only cared about keeping black and white separate. On the other side were groups of moderate and concerned citizens, both black and white, who finally realized the extremism of Faubus had gone too far. They saw the devastating consequences of closing the schools. Teachers were unemployed, property values were dropping, and the reputation of Little Rock as a progressive southern city was completely ruined. Businesses suffered as the crisis dragged on. Two key groups emerged to fight Faubus's tyranny. The first was the Women's Emergency Committee to Open Our Schools, WEC. This group, made up of prominent white women, began organizing quietly but effectively. They weren't necessarily advocates for immediate, full integration, but they were absolutely advocates for public education. They put aside racial politics for the sake of their children's future. They started phone campaigns, held meetings, and put pressure on the city officials who supported Faubus. They framed the argument not as a racial issue, but as a commitment to the American ideal of public schooling. The second group was the Stop This Outrageous Right-Wing STORE committee, which worked to elect a moderate school board that would reopen the schools and defy Faubus. The WEC and STORE mobilized hundreds of voters who were tired of the chaos and the extremism. They saw that the fight for segregation was literally holding their entire city back. Through relentless legal battles and grassroots campaigning, these groups eventually forced a referendum. The question put to the voters was simple. Should the schools stay closed, or should they reopen under a federally approved integration plan? The segregationists fought hard, but the coalition of concerned citizens prevailed. In June 1959, the federal courts ruled that the state laws used to close the schools were unconstitutional. Combined with the local pressure, the schools were ordered to reopen in the fall. The community, through immense effort, had finally defeated the governor's desperate maneuver. The Little Rock Nine were coming back, and this time, the city was tired of fighting them. In August 1959, the Little Rock High Schools reopened. The 101st Airborne was long gone, but the threat of violence had been replaced by a weary, grudging acceptance from many in the white community. The segregationists were still vocal, but their organized power had been broken by the court rulings and the community's demand for stability. 3 of the original Little Rock Nine returned to Central High. Minnie G and Brown had moved, and the others had found alternative paths to graduation during the lost year. The returning students were Carlotta Walls Lanier and Jefferson Thomas, both now seniors, and Gloria Ray Karlmark, now a junior. They came back with a heavy mix of trepidation and resolution. The atmosphere was still tense, but noticeably different from 1957. The school board, under the shadow of federal scrutiny and community demand, was forced to implement better policies. Teachers were finally instructed to maintain order and report harassment. The constant threat of being tripped or attacked in the hallways lessened considerably. The segregationist students who remained were mostly demoralized or had been warned by their own parents to avoid trouble. However, the experience of the previous 2 years had taken its toll. For Gloria Ray Karlmark, the stress became too much. She and her family faced continuous economic pressure, and the environment, though improved, was still far from welcoming. She eventually chose to leave Little Rock and move to Kansas City to finish her schooling, needing a break from the constant scrutiny and residual hostility. This left only 2 members of the original group to complete their journey at Central High: Carlotta Walls Lanier and Jefferson Thomas. They were the final 2 targets, the last link to that terrifying first day. They spent their senior year quietly, focused on their books, determined to prove that their sacrifices and the sacrifices of their families had not been in vain. They were quiet pioneers, demonstrating resilience and focus amidst what had been a prolonged trauma. They were determined to reach that stage and claim the victory that Ernest Green had won for the previous class. May 1960 arrived, and with it came the second, and arguably more profound, graduation ceremony for the Little Rock Nine. This time, it was for Carlotta Walls Lanier and Jefferson Thomas. They had endured the initial mob, the armed guards, the daily psychological torture, the expulsion of their friend, and the closing of the entire school system. Their persistence defined quiet heroism. The 1960 commencement was still under high security, but the fear and anger that had defined the 1958 ceremony had largely dissipated. When Carlotta and Jefferson walked across the stage, the atmosphere was respectful. There was no widespread refusal to applaud. The community had moved past the raw fury of 1957. The silent victory of these two young people had finally been accepted. Carlotta Walls Lanier and Jefferson Thomas received their Central High School diplomas. Their success marked the end of the Little Rock Nine's active involvement with the school system, but the beginning of a massive change for the city. Integration continued at Central High, slowly but surely, with small groups of Black students enrolling in subsequent years. The wall had been breached, and the flow of history could not be stopped. After graduation, the 9 students went on to live extraordinary lives, showing that the education they fought for was only the starting point. They became professionals, leaders, and fierce advocates for civil rights, carrying the lessons of Central High with them. Ernest Green went on to attend Michigan State University and later became Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Jimmy Carter. Minnie Jean Brown became a social worker and activist. Melba Patillo Beals became a journalist and author. Jefferson Thomas served in the U.S. Army and worked for the Department of Defense. Carlotta Walls Lanier pursued a career in real estate. They proved that the opportunity they risked their lives for was worth it, using their education to contribute meaningfully to society and continuing to inspire millions. Their sacrifice had opened the door, not just for Little Rock, but for integrated education across the South. The story of the Little Rock Nine didn't end with their graduation. It shaped the rest of their lives. For decades, they carried the scars of Central High, not just the memories of the hate, but the enormous pressure of being unwilling public figures at such a young age. They were constantly recognized, constantly asked to share their stories, and always held up as symbols of courage. Their collective experience formed an unbreakable bond. The Little Rock Nine remained friends, bound by the trauma and the triumph they shared. They often met for reunions, shared their memories, and used their platform to continue speaking out against injustice and for equal opportunity. Their story became an essential teaching tool for American history, illustrating that civil rights were not just won in courtrooms, but on the ground, through the sheer grit of ordinary people. The photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, alone against the mob, became an enduring image of resistance. The courage of the Nine was recognized globally. In 1999, President Bill Clinton honored the Little Rock Nine with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award given by the United States Congress. This was a national recognition of the immense sacrifice they made for democracy. This award recognized their physical courage and their moral fortitude. It acknowledged that they were not just students, but soldiers in a nonviolent war for freedom and equality. The lasting impact of the Little Rock Nine is immeasurable. They forced the federal government's hand, proving that the courts and the Constitution must be enforced, even against massive public resistance. Their bravery set a precedent that allowed desegregation to move forward, though painfully slowly, throughout the rest of the South. Their actions showed the world that American progress, while often messy and violent, could be achieved through peaceful protest and an unwavering belief in the principles of equality. Their fight wasn't just for a better education. It was for the very soul of the country. Today, Central High School stands as a living monument. In 1998, it was designated a National Historic Site by the U.S. South National Park Service. This is a rare honor for a functioning public school, and it speaks volumes about the historical gravity of what happened there. When you visit Little Rock, you can see the visitor center across the street, dedicated entirely to telling the story of the Little Rock Nine. The school itself is now diverse, with students of all backgrounds walking the same halls where, decades ago, armed soldiers had to stand guard. The students who walk through those doors today study in an environment that their predecessors could only dream of. The school embraces its history, using the legacy of the Nine to teach current students about civil rights, courage, and standing up for what is right. The legacy is not just historical, it's deeply personal. The Little Rock Nine taught us that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. They were told they didn't belong, but they showed up anyway. They were threatened, but they walked tall. They were children, but they were powerful enough to change the course of a nation. Their story is a powerful reminder that progress requires sacrifice. It took the willingness of 9 teenagers to put their physical safety and emotional well-being on the line to break down a system built on hate and injustice. Every step they took up those steps was a step forward for the entire country. They didn't just win the right to an education. They won a moral victory that reverberated around the world. The Little Rock Nine became proof that the Constitution matters, that equality is worth fighting for, and that the quiet, determined courage of a few young people can overcome the loudest, angriest opposition. Their voices, their actions, and their quiet walk into Central High School will echo through American history forever. Take a moment and let that sink in. 9 teenagers, 9 brave souls who changed the course of American history just by walking into a school. When you face your own challenges, remember Elizabeth Eckford standing alone. Remember Ernest Green crossing that stage. And remember the quiet, relentless resolve of the entire Little Rock Nine. They prove that education isn't just about books. It's about dignity, equality, and the fundamental right to pursue your dreams. Their story is our story, a story of a country struggling to live up to its own ideals. We owe them an incredible debt. What part of their incredible struggle stands out most to you? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world. Thank you for listening.